The Crucible of Valorax Prime wasn't the sort of place one stumbled into by accident. It was the kind of establishment that required 3 separate waivers, 2 biometric scans, and 1 very stern conversation with a medical drone about the likelihood of returning home with all one's original appendages. The arena had earned its reputation over 4 centuries of hosting the galaxy's most spectacularly violent entertainment, and the management took great pride in their mortality statistics. Well, perhaps pride wasn't quite the right word. Enthusiastic documentation seemed more appropriate. The amphitheater stretched across a kilometer of reinforced durasteel and force-dampening architecture, designed by the Vorthian Collective back when they still believed violence could be contained by proper engineering. 40,000 beings from 70 different species packed the tiered seating, creating a cacophony that would have made a supernova seem peaceful by comparison. The air recyclers worked overtime processing the various atmospheric requirements, creating distinct bands of breathable zones that shimmered like heat waves when species crossed boundaries to find better seats. At the center of this monument to sanctioned brutality sat the fighting pit itself, 100 meters of octagonal platform, its surface embedded with enough sensor technology to track a combatant's heartbeat from across the arena. The floor bore the scars of 10,000 previous contests, scorch marks and impact craters that the maintenance crews deliberately left as ambient. Above it all, holographic displays the size of small buildings broadcast every angle of the impending carnage to those unfortunate souls stuck in the cheap seats. Tonight's main event had drawn an unusually diverse crowd. Word had spread through the usual channels, the kind of information that bounced between gambling dens and military intelligence offices with equal enthusiasm. The humans were fielding another combat, their third attempt, actually, and the previous 2 had provided such memorable spectacles that attendance had tripled. The first human had lasted 7 minutes before something involving a plasma lance and poor spatial awareness had concluded the evening premature. The second had performed admirably for nearly 20 minutes, which was impressive, until one considered that most of that time had been spent retreating from a Drexilian berserker, who found the whole affair hilarious. But the humans, bless their stubborn little hearts, kept signing up. The contestant currently standing in the preparation alcove appeared to be examining her equipment with the kind of casual attention one might give to selecting fruit at a market. She stood perhaps 1.7 meters tall, built with the kind of lean muscle structure that evolution granted to persistence hunters. Her skin bore that particular shade of brown that suggested ancestry from one of Earth's equatorial regions, and her hair had been pulled back in a style that prioritized function over aesthetics. Nothing about her screamed Galactic champion. Nothing about her even whispered it polite. Her armor, if one could be generous enough to call it that, consisted of a flexible polymer bodysuit that covered her from neck to boots. No powered exoskeleton, no ablative plating, no shield generators humming with enough energy to power a small column. Just a thin layer of material that might stop a knife if the attacker was feeling particularly unenthusiastic. She'd strapped various pouches around her waist and thighs, stuffed with what appeared to be the kind of odds and ends someone might grab while rummaging through a surplus store during a clearance sale. Across the arena in the champion's alcove that came with better lighting and a complimentary beverage service, stood her opponent, Brutix the Unbreakable, the Crimson Wall of Drax. He possessed more titles than most species had vowels, each one earned through the simple expedient of not dying while others did. He stood 3 full meters tall, his bulk filling the alcove like an avalanche in pause mode. His species, the Draxonites, had evolved on a high-gravity death world, where the flowers had thorns made of tungsten, and the native wildlife considered pack hunting to mean bringing enough friends to form a small army. Brutix wore armor that looked like someone had mugged a battleship and stolen its hull plating. 30 centimeters of layered composite wrapped every portion of his body, each piece custom forged from materials that cost more than most planets' annual defense budget. Servo motors whined softly at every joint, compensating for the tremendous weight. His helmet featured enough sensor arrays to track a neutrino through a neutron star, and the 4 arms of his species, each carried weapons that the Galactic Weapons Convention had specifically requested remain holstered during public appearance. His force field generator alone massed more than the human's entire kit. The device, a masterwork of Corvithian engineering, projected a barrier capable of absorbing enough kinetic energy to stop a freight hauler at ramming speed. It pulsed with a faint crimson glow, creating a heat shimmer around his massive frame. Military analysts estimated the shield could withstand sustained fire from a platoon of heavy infantry for approximately 45 minutes before requiring a reach. The human had brought what appeared to be determination and a concerning lack of self-preservation instinct. The arena's master of ceremonies, a Vexillian whose vocal apparatus could produce sounds across 17 different frequency ranges, began the pre-match announcement. Most species heard it as an impressive rumbling declaration of the combatants' credentials. Humans, with their limited auditory range, got the abridged version through their translation implant. Something about honor and glory, and please remember that concession insurance sold at the door didn't cover catastrophic dismemberment. Brutix emerged from his alcove to a wall of sound. His fan base, accumulated over 15 years of undefeated combat, roared their approval. Holographic banners displaying his various kill counts scrolled across the upper decks. Bookmakers adjusted odds in real time as spectators placed final wagers. The smart money, which was to say most of it, heavily favored the walking tank who'd never lost a match. The human stepped onto the platform with significantly less fanfare. A few polite applause bursts from the diplomatic section, where representatives from various embassies maintained the pretense of supporting their species. Some scattered cheering from what appeared to be other humans in the crowd, perhaps 24 in total, who'd decided that watching their species champion face probable dismemberment was an excellent way to spend an evening. Brutix crossed the platform with footsteps that registered on the seismic sensors. He stopped at the center mark and looked down at his opponent, his four eyes processing her appearance with what might have been confusion if one could read Draxonite expression. For several long seconds, he simply stared. Then, in a gesture that translated across every species present, he threw back his massive head and laughed. The sound boomed across the arena, amplified by his armor's external speakers. Deep, rumbling, genuinely amused laughter. He gestured with one of his upper arms at her minimal equipment, then at his own formidable plating, then back at her. The crowd picked up on it immediately. Chuckles rippled through the stands, building into waves of mirth. One of the commentators, a Peltharian, whose species prided itself on tactical analysis, observed through the broadcast system that this might be the shortest match in recent memory. His co-commentator, demonstrating the kind of optimism that only came from having never actually been punched, suggested they might witness a new record for fastest concession. The human, for her part, simply stood there with her hands relaxed at her sides. Her expression hadn't changed. She watched Brutix with the kind of patient attention that suggested she was waiting for him to finish his moment, rather than being intimidated by it. When the laughter finally subsided and the crowd's amusement settled into eager anticipation, she tilted her head slightly and spoke. The translation implants carried her words across the arena in 70 different languages. Her tone suggested she might have been asking if he'd finished with the salt shaker at dinner. Brutix's laughter cut off. He leaned forward slightly, his sensors scanning her again as if perhaps he'd missed some hidden weapon system. Finding nothing, he straightened and activated his weapons. Twin plasma lances extended from his lower arms, their containment fields crackling with barely restrained violence. His upper arms engaged massive kinetic drivers that could punch through starship armor. The referee, a biomechanical construct, whose entire existence revolved around ensuring combatants followed the rules before they killed each other, floated to the platform's edge. It announced the standard regulations in rapid-fire monotone: no targeting of audience members, no weaponized antimatter, no temporal manipulation devices. The usual restrictions that suggested previous matches had gotten creative, in unfortunate ways. The starting tone sounded a pure note that hung in the recycled air for one crystalline moment. Then Brutix charged, and the galaxy got its show. The charge of a 3-meter Draxonite warrior in full combat armor generated approximately the same amount of kinetic energy as a small meteorite, experiencing an unplanned land. The platform's surface cracked under each footfall, stress fractures spiderwebbing across reinforced durasteel that had been rated for impacts up to Class 7. Brutix wasn't merely running, he was demonstrating what happened when physics and violence reached a mutual understanding. The human moved sideways, not backward, which would have been the conventional retreat of someone facing an ambulatory avalanche, not forward, which would have been suicide. Just laterally, A simple sidestep that carried her exactly 1 meter to the left, executed with the kind of casual precision that suggested muscle memory rather than panic. Brutix thundered past her position, his momentum carrying him another 3 meters, before his servo motors screamed in protest. As they reversed his trajectory, the crowd's roar hit a confused note. That wasn't how these things typically went. Usually the first charge involved impact, flying bodies, and commentators scrambling to describe the carnage in appropriately dramatic terms. This had been more like watching someone avoid a puddle. Brutix wheeled around, his 4 eyes tracking his opponent with renewed focus. The human had already shifted position again, circling along the platform's edge, with steps that seemed almost lazy in their unhurried rhythm. She hadn't drawn any weapons, hadn't activated any defensive system. She was simply walking, her body language suggesting she might be taking a pleasant stroll through a park, rather than fighting for her life. The Draxonite warrior decided that subtlety was overrated. His upper right arm snapped forward, the kinetic driver launching a projectile that crossed the intervening space at just under supersonic velocity. The round, designed to punch through light vehicle armor, should have turned his opponent into an aerosol mist of regrettable biology. The human dropped into a crouch that looked more like she'd decided to examine something on the ground. The projectile screamed through the space where her torso had been, continuing its journey until it impacted the far arena wall with enough force to trigger the emergency barrier system. She rose from her crouch in a smooth motion, and kept walking, her path taking her in a wide arc around the champion. What the crowd couldn't see, but the sensor technicians monitoring the match were beginning to notice, was the pattern. Every movement, every step, every shift in position, followed precise angles relative to Brutix's facing. She wasn't randomly dodging, she was calculating, processing. The human brain, that peculiar organ evolved by a species that had somehow survived on a planet seemingly designed to kill them, was running combat algorithms that most species required computer assistance to manage. Brutix fired again, then each shot forced the human into increasingly rapid evasions, her movements becoming a flowing sequence of ducks, slides and pivots. To the untrained eye it looked desperate. To anyone who understood combat mathematics, it looked like she was mapping his attack patterns, building a predictive model of his behavior through direct observation and immediate adaptation. The Peltharian commentator noted, with grudging professional respect, that the human's survival time had already exceeded expectations. His co-commentator wondered aloud if perhaps the human was simply making the audience feel they'd gotten their money's worth before the inevitable conclusion. Neither of them had noticed what the sensor data was quietly revealing. Brutix's force field was cycling, repeatedly, each time the human moved into striking range, and then immediately retreated. The shield adjusted its parameters, compensating for the potential threat. The system, designed by engineers who'd never encountered human combat doctrine, operated on the logical assumption that threats moved predictably. They charged, they circled, they maintained consistent patterns that allowed the field to optimize its energy distribution. Humans, it turned out, had never received that particular memo. The human closed distance suddenly, cutting inside Brutix's reach with a burst of speed that bordered on reckless. Her hand lashed out, not in a strike but in a touch, palm flat against the shimmering barrier of his force field. Contact lasted perhaps a quarter second before she disengaged, rolling backward, as one of his massive fists hammered down on the space she'd occupied. The shield flickered, just for an instant, a microsecond disruption that the generators immediately compensated for, stabilizing the field at full strength. Brutix didn't notice. The crowd didn't notice, but the human had felt it, that moment of feedback, the way the field responded to direct contact pressure, rather than projectile impact. Information. She'd just learned something important about Corvathian engineering. Brutix roared, the sound carrying enough volume to rattle teeth across 3 separate atmosphere zones. Enough playing, enough patience. He activated all 4 weapons simultaneously, creating a kill zone of overlapping fire lanes that should have left no escape vector. Plasma lances carved molten tracks across the platform, while kinetic rounds filled the air with supersonic death. The human went low, then lower, her body flattening in ways that made several species in the audience genuinely uncomfortable.
She slid across the scarred platform surface, using the terrain's existing damage as makeshift cover, her momentum carrying her through gaps in the fire pattern that existed for fractions of seconds. One plasma bolt passed close enough to her shoulder that the bodysuit's material blistered and smoked. She came up inside his guard again, moving with the kind of acceleration that human leg muscles could produce when properly motivated by imminent mortality. This time, instead of touching, she struck, fist against force field, a proper punch delivered with her full body weight behind it, targeting the exact point where she'd made contact before. The shield held. Obviously, it was designed to stop anti-vehicle weapons. A human fist, regardless of technique or determination, generated perhaps 800 joules of force. The field absorbed energies measured in megajoules, but it flickered again, longer this time, a full half-second of instability before the generators compensated and restored full integrity. Brutix swung at her, a backhand strike that would have removed her head from her shoulders if it connected. She ducked under it, stepped into his center mass, and delivered 3 rapid strikes to 3 different points on his shield. Each impact produced that same flicker, each disruption lasting incrementally longer than the last. The sensor technicians were now actively alarmed, their warnings flooding the arena's technical channels. Something was wrong with the field harmonics. The pattern shouldn't be possible. Kinetic impact below the threshold shouldn't generate cascade resonance. That wasn't how the physics worked. Except apparently, when applied by a species that had spent its entire evolutionary history learning how to break things.
The Corvathian shield engineers, watching from their luxury box with beverages that cost more than most species earned annually, had stopped drinking. Their external translator units struggled to process the increasingly frantic conversations as they reviewed telemetry data that shouldn't exist. Force fields operated on principles of energy dispersion and harmonic stabilization. You fed power into the generators. They created a barrier, and that barrier absorbed incoming force by distributing it across the entire field matrix. Simple, elegant, proven effective across 200 years of military application. Nobody had apparently informed the human that punching the same spot repeatedly with inadequate force was supposed to be useless. Brutix had abandoned strategy in favor of overwhelming violence, which was traditionally where Draxonites excelled. His 4 arms worked in coordinated fury, weapons cycling through firing patterns that would have reduced a light tank to constituent atom. The platform beneath them had degraded from battle-scarred to structurally questionable, with entire sections glowing cherry red from plasma impacts. Emergency crews stood ready at the arena perimeter, their equipment primed for what they professionally termed catastrophic containment failure. The human kept hitting him, not wild swings, not desperate flailing. Each strike targeted specific points on his shield with the kind of methodical precision that suggested she was working from a checklist. Left lower quadrant, right upper section, center mass at a 45-degree angle. She wove between his attacks with movements that looked less like combat and more like some aggressive form of dancing, her body bending and twisting through angles that made the Draxonites in the audience uncomfortable and the species with external skeletons physically ill. What made it worse, from Brutix's perspective, was that she was fast. Not supernaturally fast, not even particularly fast by the standards of various speed-adapted species present, but fast in the way that mattered in combat. Her reaction time, that critical delay between seeing a threat and responding to it, clocked in at approximately 150 milliseconds. Humans, through some cosmic joke of evolutionary pressure, had developed neural pathways optimized for throwing rocks at prey animals and not being eaten by things with more teeth. This apparently translated well to not being liquefied by alien warlords. Brutix's force field flickered again. Then again, the intervals between flickers were shortening. What had started as isolated disruptions had evolved into a rhythm, a cascading pattern of instability that spread across the shield matrix like cracks in ice. The generators screamed, dumping emergency power reserves into maintaining cohesion, burning through energy at rates that would drain the system in minutes rather than hours. The Pelthurian commentator had gone quiet, his tactical analysis software apparently experiencing the equivalent of a nervous breakdown. His co-commentator filled the silence with increasingly uncertain observations about human persistence and the entertainment value of watching someone slowly accomplish the impossible. The human landed another combination, 3 strikes, different angles, delivered in the span of a heartbeat. The shield held, but now it was making sounds. High-pitched whines that indicated stress harmonics building in the generator coils. Brutax staggered backward, not from the impacts themselves but from the sudden power fluctuation, as his armor's system struggled to compensate. Here was the thing about human evolution that most galactic species failed to appreciate, until it was too late. Humans came from a planet that had tried very hard to kill them for several million years. Their homeworld featured predators with better speed, better strength, better natural weapons. It had diseases that rewrote genetic code for entertainment. It had weather patterns that could shift from pleasant to apocalyptic during lunch break. Everything on Earth, from the microscopic to the massive, had been engaged in an extended competition to remove humans from the evolutionary equation. Humans had responded by becoming the most stubbornly adaptable species in their planet's history. They learned. They adapted. They looked at problems that should have killed them and asked, "But what if we just didn't die though?" Then they proceeded to not die through sheer bloody-minded refusal to accept reasonable limitations. The human had spent the first portion of the match learning exactly how Brutax's shield responded to stress. Now she was teaching it to fail. She closed again, and this time Brutax was ready. He'd been conserving one weapon system, waiting for the right moment. His lower left arm snapped up, revealing a pulse cannon that technically violated several arena regulations, but had been grandfathered in due to tradition and the amount of money his matches generated. The weapon charged, energy coils glowing white-hot, preparing to deliver a blast that would vaporize everything in a 3-meter cone. The human saw it coming. Her eyes tracked the weapon's orientation, her brain calculating angles and timing with the kind of unconscious mathematics that came from a species that had invented trigonometry specifically to hit distant targets with rocks. She had perhaps 1 second before the weapon fired. 1 second to evade, to escape the kill zone, to survive. She stepped forward instead, directly into optimal firing range. Her right hand shot out, fingers extended, and struck the shield at the precise point where the weapon's barrel met the field boundary. Not a punch this time, a thrust. Fingertips first. The bodysuit's material, designed with just enough rigidity to transfer force efficiently, concentrated her entire body's momentum into a contact point, roughly the size of a credit chip. The force field shattered, not failed, not flickered, shattered. The entire matrix collapsed in a cascading failure that ripped through every generator simultaneously, each one overloading, as it tried to compensate for the catastrophic harmonic disruption. Brutax's armor lit up with warning indicators. Emergency systems screaming alerts across every spectrum. The shield, that masterwork of Corvathian engineering that had never failed in combat, died with a sound like breaking glass amplified through a stadium speaker system. The pulse cannon fired, at point-blank range, with nothing between the weapon and its target, except hope and rapidly ionizing air. The blast should have erased the human from existence, leaving nothing but a scorch mark and some regrettable molecules. The human twisted. Her entire body rotated around her planted foot, using Brutax's own massive arm as a pivot point. The energy blast passed through the space where her torso had been, close enough that her bodysuit ignited along one side, material burning away to expose skin that would need medical attention later if there was a later. The blast continued past her and struck Brutax's own chest plate. His armor, designed to protect against external threats, had not been optimized for absorbing his own weapon's fire from the inside of his defensive perimeter. The pulse cannon's energy scattered across his torso, overloading circuits and fusing circuits. The impact threw him backward, his massive frame stumbling, balance compromised by the sudden system failures cascading through his suit. The human landed from her twist, both feet planted, and looked up at the towering warrior who'd been laughing at her 5 minutes ago. Then she smiled. The arena had gone silent in the way that 40,000 beings collectively holding their breath produced. Not actual silence, because that many biological systems couldn't truly stop making noise, but the kind of profound quiet that made the ambient hum of life support systems seem deafening. Even the commentators had lost their words, their carefully prepared dramatic phrases dying somewhere between their speech centers and their vocal apparatus. Brutix the Unbreakable stood in the center of the platform, surrounded by the sparking remains of his shield generators, portions of his armor scorched and smoking from his own weapon discharge. His 4 eyes focused on the human with an expression that his species used to convey the rough equivalent of "I have made a terrible miscalculation." The human, for her part, looked like she'd been involved in a moderate industrial accident. Her bodysuit had burn marks along the right side, several pouches had torn loose during her acrobatics, and her breathing came harder now, adrenaline and exertion taking their biological toll. But she was standing, mobile, still very much interested in continuing this conversation through the medium of violence. Brutix made his decision. He charged again, because Draxonites didn't do retreat, and his pride wouldn't survive suggesting concession. But this time the charge carried a different quality. This was the attack of someone who'd realized the small thing in front of him might actually be dangerous. His weapons fired in controlled bursts, establishing kill zones, forcing movement patterns, demonstrating the tactical education that had kept him alive through 15 years of arena combat. The human read his intent and adjusted. Where before she'd been learning, now she was implementing. Her movements carried the efficiency of someone who'd finished the research phase and moved into practical application. She went low under a plasma lance, used a piece of destroyed platform as momentary cover, came up inside his reach and delivered a kick to his knee joint. Brutix's armor absorbed most of the impact, but not all. The servo motors in that leg stuttered, briefly offline, forcing him to shift weight. It was a minor inconvenience, barely worth noting in the scope of the fight, except the human had already moved to his other side and struck the corresponding joint. Then a third strike to his lower back, where the armor plates overlapped and servo clusters bunched together. She was systemically disabling his mobility. The Draxonite warrior swung with his upper arms, massive fists that could pulverize concrete. The human didn't try to block or deflect, because that would have been approximately as useful as arguing with a lance. She simply wasn't there when the fists arrived, her position shifting in small increments that kept her perpetually at the edge of his reach. Every time he committed to an attack, she'd already identified the opening it created, and moved to exploit it. Brutix landed a hit. Finally, his lower right fist caught her in the ribs as she misjudged a dodge, the impact lifting her off her feet and sending her tumbling across the platform. The crowd erupted, bloodlust satisfied by the sight of the human crashing into the scorched dewar. The Draxonite pressed his advantage, closing the distance with thunderous steps, raising his arms for a finishing strike that would end this absurd contest. The human rolled to her feet, slower than before, one hand briefly touching her ribs where the impact had landed, checking for breaks through the haze of pain. She looked up at the approaching champion and did something that made half the arena question her sanity. She laughed. Not hysterical laughter, not the sound of someone whose mind had broken under stress. Just a short, genuine burst of amusement at the sheer absurdity of her situation. Here she was, facing down a 3-meter warrior covered in the equivalent of a tank's worth of armor, armed with weapons that could level buildings, on a platform in front of 40,000 spectators who'd paid to watch her probable death. And she'd just successfully destroyed his supposedly impregnable defense system by hitting it repeatedly. Sometimes the universe was funny. Brutix hesitated, thrown off by the response. In his extensive combat experience, opponents generally didn't laugh when losing. They screamed, begged, or accepted their fate with dignity. Laughter suggested either insanity or knowledge he didn't possess, and neither option was comforting. The human moved, not away from him this time, but directly forward, closing distance at a full sprint. Brutix brought his weapons to bear, but she was already inside the firing angle, too close for the plasma lances to track, moving through his defensive envelope, with the confidence of someone who'd mapped every vulnerability his armor possessed. She jumped, planted one foot on his knee joint, used his torso as a stepping point, and launched herself at his helmet. Her fist, hardly larger than his smallest finger, struck the sensor array on his faceplate. The punch itself did negligible damage to the hardened material, but the sensors, designed for precision rather than durability, shattered.
His visual feed died, replaced by static and error messages. The human dropped back to the platform. As Brutix staggered, temporarily blinded, his backup system struggling to compensate, she landed behind him and delivered a precise strike to the base of his skull, where armor plates met, and exposed the vulnerable servo cluster controlling his upper body movement. Brutix's arms locked up, all four of them, frozen in position as the control systems spanned and failed. His leg servos were still functional, but without arm movement, without vision, without his shield, he was effectively a very large statue with anger management issues. The referee construct floated closer, its sensors analyzing the situation with mechanical objectivity. Brutix couldn't effectively attack, couldn't defend, couldn't realistically continue the match without violating several safety protocols that even the Crucible of Valarax Prime had to respect. The construct's voice echoed across the arena, declaring the match concluded due to technical incapacitation. The human had won. The silence returned, deeper this time, as 40,000 beings processed what they'd just witnessed. The bookmakers stared at their systems displaying catastrophic losses. The Corvathian engineers looked at their ruined shield technology, with expressions suggesting they'd need to reconsider some fundamental assumptions about physics. The diplomatic section sat frozen, unsure whether to celebrate or start planning damage control for the political implications. Then the humans in the crowd, those 24 who'd come to watch their representative, started cheering, not politely, not diplomatically, with the kind of enthusiastic volume that suggested they'd been waiting their entire lives to watch someone from Earth make the galaxy collectively question its assumption. The human walked to the platform's edge, breathing hard, definitely going to need medical attention for those ribs, probably going to feel this fight for weeks. She looked up at the sea of alien faces, at the species who'd dismissed her equipment as inadequate, her size as disadvantageous, her chances as negligible. Then she raised one fist in the air, knuckles still bleeding from where they'd punched through a force field that wasn't supposed to be punchable. The gesture translated across every species present. In the luxury boxes, military analysts were already composing reports. Emergency meetings were being scheduled. Combat doctrine that had stood for centuries was being hastily reconsidered. Because if one human with minimal equipment could dismantle a champion through nothing but adaptation, persistence, and a fundamental unwillingness to accept that biology should lose to technology, what could trained human soldiers do? What could human fleets accomplish? What did it mean that Earth had just been invited to join galactic civilization, and nobody had properly stress-tested human combat capabilities? The Peltharian commentator finally found his voice, declaring this the most significant upset in arena history. His co-commentator managed something about humans, and their disturbing talent for making the impossible look routine. Down in the medical bay, as technicians worked on Brutix's armor, and what remained of his dignity, the Draxonite warrior asked the question that would echo through military academies for the next decade. What exactly do humans eat on their homeworld that makes them like this? The medical drone accessing Earth's biological database provided a cheerfully clinical answer about persistence hunting, endurance evolution, and a diet that included substances most species considered toxic. Brutix listened to the explanation with growing horror, realizing he'd just fought a species that had evolved by literally running their prey to death over distances that would kill most galactic citizens. The drone helpfully added that humans also consumed ethanol recreationally, a substance that would hospitalize or kill 70% of known species. Brutix decided he was retiring from arena combat, effective immediately. Up in the arena, the human was being escorted to her own medical evaluation, surrounded by officials who weren't quite sure how to process what they'd witnessed. She walked with the slightly unsteady gait of someone discovering that yes, getting punched by an alien warlord did in fact hurt as much as it looked like it should. But she was walking on a platform where most combatants left horizontal. The arena's maintenance crew surveyed the damage with resignation, calculating repair costs and wondering if they should start charging humans a deposit. The platform looked like it had hosted a small war, which wasn't inaccurate. Somewhere in the facility's administrative offices, Lawyers were already drafting new equipment regulations, trying to figure out how to classify human capabilities, when the humans themselves seemed unclear about their own limitations. And in the quiet spaces between official reports and public statements, a truth began circulating through the galaxy's military establishments, a truth that would reshape strategic thinking and alliance negotiations, a truth that started as rumor and hardened into uncomfortable fact. Humans didn't need heavy plating because they'd spent their evolutionary history learning to break everything else first. The galaxy had just learned that sometimes, the scariest thing in the universe wasn't the species with the biggest guns or the strongest shield. It was the species that looked at those advantages and asked, with genuine curiosity and disturbing enthusiasm, exactly how hard they'd need to hit them to make them stop working. The Crucible of Valarax Prime would host many more matches, but nobody ever laughed at human armor again.